Ryan, are you ready?
Yeah, I think so. Can you hear me and stuff?
The Marxist project, are you ready?
Yeah, I'm good.
Israel's violation of Palestinian human rights through investment and supporting the Orthodox Church.
It's not that some people are just too dumb to understand it. I mean, that's complete nonsense, right? It can be taught to anyone. It is intuitive to some degree, and it's not like an intelligence thing.
And, we had some placards, one of them which said the pretty factual point that Zionism is racism.
It's not just a moral stand, it's a political stand. What you're talking about is the role that Israel plays securing the interests of US and British imperialism in the Middle East.
And I would be talking about Iraq or Afghanistan or something today where I am, and I understand these conflicts that have literally been going on since I was born. It's just horrifying.
It's not British culture, it's just the world's culture. They love stories, they love this idea that there is this nation that looks like this. I think it's a distraction from the class struggle, to be honest.
Hi everyone, thank you for coming.
Hey, thank you.
Thanks for tuning to Revolutionary Lumpen Radio. In this episode, we're joined by a live studio audience on the International Leftist Discord server, in which they're celebrating 1,000 members. Rick Sanchez, the admin of the server, invited both myself, Shibby, and Ryan, the Zen Marxist, the co-host for the podcast, to come along and even try and get the Marxist Project as a special guest on a live episode. So we're extremely grateful for the Marxist Project from YouTube to spend the time with us and allow us to interview him. So we ask him about his background, agitprop, Marxism in general, and his experiences on YouTube. And we also spend a good hour and a half on a Q&A session with the guest from the server. We had some really great, interesting questions on the Q&A. Definitely stick around for that. Towards the end, we talk about fascism, we talk about the elections that just happened, we talk about fighting imperialism from within the belly of the beast and also China. It's a genuinely interesting episode, and I'm not just saying that because it's my podcast. It really is really interesting. You're going to get a lot out of it. So without further ado, let's dive into the interview with the Marxist Project. We always love to start off an episode with a background check on a guest, because the listeners would like to know a little bit about yourself, where you grew up, how you got into politics, what drawn you towards the left, how you got into YouTube, all of that would be interesting just to get this episode going.
Yeah, good questions, of course. I don't go into very specific details about my personal background, but to that degree, I would say I mostly grew up in the United States. Originally, I'm from Russia, but most of my formative years and my education I spent here in America. And that actually kind of answers the question of what brought me to the left. My family, being from the former Soviet Union, already had pretty substantial exposure to socialist ideas, and that was kind of always like conversation around the kitchen table, so to speak. And coming to America, you kind of get exposed to a very distorted, almost perverted notion of what socialism is, what the Soviet Union's history was. And growing up, that kind of was just always so apparent to me that there was one narrative in school and another one at home, and there was so much disunity there between the way that particular topic was discussed. And that really brought me to the left, because I started looking into these things more thoroughly. And at first it was just stories from family members, but eventually it kind of became a more concerted effort to study both the history and the theory. So that's really my background into how I got into the left. I would say in the last few years, I've gotten a lot more serious about studying Marxism and really trying to approach it from as systematic and educational of a lens as possible. Yeah, I think that would be a good, concise answer to those questions. I don't know if there's anything else you want me to talk about.
Awesome, thank you for that. Just an interesting point with your family being from the Soviet Union, and you talked about this narrative. It was different at home than it was in school. But I was actually on Facebook the other day, and I had an old work colleague pop up on my post saying that like he was from the Soviet Union and like I wasn't, so like he thinks that the Soviet Union was like terrible and communism's terrible. So I just want people to recognize that distinction, that you do hear people condemning the Soviet Union who are from these states, but you're also an example of some of the many people from the Soviet Union who are saying that it's a success. And I think that that's largely because of, I guess, were your parents more politically aware than the average liberal? So thank you for that answer anyway. So with that being said, like, we just want to say that we love your channel. I think that I first saw it probably like a year ago. Anybody who like comes over and tries to like engage with education on the left, I think is going to stumble across it. So since like I saw it a year ago, you've gained like over 12,000 followers, subscribers. If you haven't subscribed, go and subscribe to the Marxist Project. You have received a lot of support from comrades in the form of like comments, upvotes, shares, even Patreon support, which is great. So I think that all of that, though, why I'm saying is because largely thanks to like what I believe is like how well presented your educational, analytic, historical videos are, which are always like supported by like actual source material. Like you've always got the links in there. So I just wonder, like, why did you start the Marxist Project as a YouTube channel? Like, what kind of feedback have you gotten, and like, how did that compare to your expectations before you went into it?
Yeah, I think for me, it really began, like I said, when I, a few years ago, decided to take on this task of learning about Marxism more systematically. And I think it was around the time that I was finishing reading Volume 1 of Capital. I realized, as someone who greatly benefits from like visual learning and audio-based learning, I would go online to try and find resources to complement the texts that I was reading, including, you know, the original stuff by Marx, but also the secondary content written by other scholars. And it really occurred to me that there is a sort of a missing element in the left in terms of the content that was being produced, especially on YouTube. And there weren't these types of videos, which, you know, the kinds of videos that I'm essentially putting out now, where there's an emphasis on the theory going back to like the originals, the classic elements, the fundamentals, as my series is called. And it's broken down in simple, sort of digestible parts, hopefully, at any rate. And it draws directly from those passages. So it was actually me recognizing that I didn't have that many videos to watch while reading Capital Volume 1. That kind of made me think, well, maybe I will start something like this on my own. And for me, at the beginning, it was kind of like a way to process my own thoughts, I guess. And I don't know how many people might be familiar with the experience of teaching in general, but as you teach, you kind of learn the subject even better yourself, because you're forced to recapitulate the main arguments and sort of present the information as succinctly as possible to be efficient with how you're presenting the overall theory. So yeah, it was kind of like an internal project for a while. And in the beginning, yeah, there was like some interest, but really things started to kick off. I agree to an extent that it is because of the format, but I also just feel like the interest in these topics has been growing over the last few years. So I often just feel like I'm riding this wave of people who are already interested in this type of information. And all I'm really doing is providing a space and content in that kind of area that is already growing by itself. But in terms of feedback, it's been really surprisingly positive. I kind of expected it to be somewhat mixed because, you know, Marxism is still a very controversial philosophy, school of thought. But I think it's largely because I'm sticking to, like I was saying, sticking to like the original source material a lot. And it is because I'm sourcing a lot of my content and I'm like spending time being very close to the texts, essentially. It doesn't really leave much room for people who are just going in there to say the usual stuff, you know, like Venezuela is bad and like communism killed 100 million people. It doesn't really add up to the videos as I'm presenting them. So in order for people to critically engage with my content, I feel like they need to critically engage with the text because I'm just heavily relying on it. And as a result, it's been mostly just leftists watching my content and I guess finding some value in it, and very little from the right overall. a couple comments here and there with the usual stuff, and even a few comments that were productive in terms of discussing limitations maybe of the theory. But yeah, good feedback in general.
Absolutely. Ryan, have you got any thoughts or distinctions from your experience? Because you've got a YouTube channel as well.
Yeah, I do. I mean, I love the idea of learning through teaching. I think that's a great way of doing things. I've always thought of doing things that way because, like you say, it forces you to engage the material and you have to actually understand it yourself before you're able to teach things. So I love that idea. And also going back to what you said earlier about, having personal experience with the Soviet Union, that must have been so much more helpful when dealing with sort of bourgeois propaganda in school, right? Because I imagine that all the other children there had no such experience that way. So they're much more likely to accept what they're hearing in schools as being true, whereas you have that sort of inoculation against sort of bourgeois propaganda from personal experience. So that's great as well.
Yeah, absolutely. It really was about noticing that there were discrepancies in the way that the Soviet Union was being talked about, and really even modern Russia, because oftentimes I would hear in school that Russia was still like a communist dictatorship or whatever. And to me, like once you're confronted by this dominant narrative that's so blatantly wrong at face value, it really kind of makes you question the rest of the assumptions that are like peripheral to it, So if the narrative about the Soviet Union is so off and inconsistent, then is the narrative about Marxism in general off? And that, like that environment of sort of implicitly questioning everything by nature of finding that one problematic area, that really helped me personally sort of be political from a young age and be very critically oriented.
Awesome. I really wanted to say to you, you actually read Capital Volume 1, like power to you. That is one dense text. Like that's no easy, like that's actually a milestone. Awesome. And as you said, like that inspired you. That's why you're a good comment as well. That inspired you. Because not only did we able to understand these thoughts explicitly about capital and economic theory that Marx had, but you also wanted to share that and teach that to others. And in that teaching, as you both clearly said, you become a better, practitioner yourself. Because you're learning through the teaching. I've always said to others, start a podcast, you get interviews, you speak to people, you're doing research yourself to produce good episodes, anything like that. Even just trying to focus on writing really does help, like, gather your thoughts and find your voice. And that's what we need to spread class consciousness out there to people. That's why we're doing this. We're not doing it for the good of our health. We're doing it to teach and inspire and radicalize others, so that we can become better comrades in the international proletarian struggle. Good stuff there. I want to just come back to that a little bit, because we're going to talk about and compare with maybe like other YouTubers out there, but we'll just talk about the elections for a minute, because it's happened and everybody's like trying to let it all sink in what's happened. Biden's won over Trump. Let's just discuss that for a moment. Thought it would be important if, like, together, like, we shared our thoughts on the electoral process for like our listeners, to give like a short, sort of like Marxist principled take on like voting and US politics in particular. What did you personally make of like the candidates, the process, and like more importantly, like how do you think like democratic elections of like public representatives would like look in like socialism in the future, just to like compare with what we're seeing here now? I think like that would be a good thought exercise to like help a comrades like gain a vision of the future after the revolution, and then like compare with now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I really like that question. I like that because I think it prompts something that the left doesn't often do, which is sort of picture what the post-revolutionary society looks like. And we're often caught up in the critique of capitalism, which is obviously where Marxism is probably the strongest. But yeah, this is a really good question. I guess I'll start in the beginning about the candidates themselves. And I know that there's been some divide there on the left between people who think that Biden is a better alternative or Trump. And I think for the most part, I think most of us on the left can agree that there isn't a massive distinction in the material sense what's going to come of Biden and Trump's administration. I personally, this is just my experience and my perspective, I do think that there is some value in a Biden victory, in that I think that the Trump administration was starting to signal a readiness to criminalize certain political activity with its, denunciation of Antifa and its categorization of Antifa as a terrorist organization. I think that obviously all of that is complete bogus, but to the degree that the administration was ready to act on that, and to the degree that we saw it do that in certain cities, like in Portland and out on the West Coast, where we had like unmarked vans kidnapping protesters, I have to ask myself, would it be easier to organize under Biden or under Trump? And to me, the answer is more or less clear. And that is that the Biden administration is going to be less overtly hostile to the real left. And of course, it will continue to exert the same kinds of neoliberal pressures that we're already very familiar with. But I do feel like Trump administration for the left, it represented a very dangerous turn in the liberal order towards something that would have required a really concerted level of resistance that I'm not sure the left is ready for. I think that we're not quite organizationally there. I'm not sure we're there in numbers, in theoretical readiness. So I guess if I have to make a ruling, I think it's a more positive thing that Biden won, because I feel like it gives us a little more time to prepare and to really organize ourselves. Because at least in the United States, we are still just at the beginning of organizing both leftist movements and labor and student unions and all kinds of groups. I think that all of that is just now budding, and we need time to do that, and in a space where that's even possible, I guess. But in terms of what elections might look like outside of a capitalist system, I think most people who followed the American elections are aware that there isn't really anything democratic about them. And not just in the traditional Marxist critique of, capitalist liberal elections not being democratic, but just in the most literal and practical sense, the United States electoral college system and its first past the post voting structure doesn't really reward proportional representation at all. And I know some European countries are better about this, despite being liberal and capitalist themselves. But the United States, in my opinion, is particularly bad about having adequate public representation. And I think that's perfectly manifested in the fact that there really are only two nominal parties, and arguably really only one party. How that would look different in a socialist society, maybe even a socialist society in America, I think, and this is again more opinion than it is fact-based, but I think that one of the critical things will be returning to or implementing a more proportional representation system. One where popular votes count more than they do now, because right now it's easily manipulatable. And I think that really is exacerbated by the fact that in capitalist elections in general, there's already a predilection towards entanglement of financial elements where, you've got campaign financing affecting the elections. All of that would be very much not present in, I think, a representative system under socialism. And I spent some time talking about this in one of my earlier videos, where I talk about, council democracy or Soviet democracy, depending on how you want to call it. And the idea of a democratic system that's it integrates the political and the economic. I think a lot of us are familiar with that idea of having like factory workers elect representatives and cooperatives elect representatives. Economic spaces as well as social and political spaces, and then having more vertical accountability instead of horizontal accountability. Whereas in the American system, you've got like the legislative and executive and judicial branches are supposedly, meant to balance each other out. But that sort of horizontality more or less excludes the American public from holding politicians accountable. And I think in socialism, it would be a heavier emphasis on the public's direct ability to hold elected representatives accountable. And that could be done through the Soviet principle of recall, where, representatives are held to a firm mandate and that they're elected on a very specific basis of what they need to accomplish. And if that isn't accomplished, they are immediately recalled. So there's just a lot of different structural changes that could occur. I think the biggest ones would be obviously eliminating a lot of the American institutions around voting, like the Electoral College. I think is a mess in terms of proportional representation. Yeah, I mean, I could talk about this for a long time because there's a lot wrong with the American political system. In terms of voting, especially, it's something that I will end by saying that it's something that the left needs to be talking more about. Because as you can already see, like I'm almost tripping up on how many different possibilities there could be and how many different possible like policy directions we could go for. And I think that just hasn't been explored very much yet. I mean, how many places can we think of? How many like intellectual spaces where they're talking about what a socialist electoral system might look like and how we might implement it in a real sense, like from today to tomorrow, not just in like a theoretical, once we get there, it'll look like this, you know? So it's a really good question. And I really urge people to look into it a lot more. I think it's something we should all talk about frequently.
Great answer. Ryan, have you got any thoughts on it?
Oh man, too many things. So many directions you can go with that, honestly. But, you know, one thing I think of a lot recently, and, you know, we did a video on this earlier today, was sort of the actual difference between a Biden and a Trump administration. One of the really important things to consider is, you know, how much the presidency is on train tracks, so to speak. You know, like how much of what happens there is actually overdetermined by material conditions. I think, you know, people who want to make the case that there is a sort of considerable enough difference between Biden and Trump are having a really good time this year in making that case, because with something like a pandemic, you know, that is really one of the things I can think of where it does make a difference as to the sort of personality of the individual in the White House, not only when it comes to, you know, signing executive orders and things, which Trump most certainly, you know, never did and didn't accept it anyway. Rhetoric also plays a key difference. You know, they are just words ultimately, but it does, you know, change how things happen. When it comes to, you know, things like policy abroad, I honestly can't see there being that big of a difference.
And that's an important one, isn't it? Because we're talking about like being anti-imperialist here.
I mean, we talked about this earlier, right? Like, we were talking about, you know, scientific Marxism. And if it's truly scientific, you know, one of the things you should be able to do with a scientific theory is make predictions, right? So I made a series of predictions over, you know, the next 4 years, what we can see or what we would see with a Biden administration. And I'll see how many of them come true. But, you know, we've just seen in Bolivia, the movement towards socialism, Mass Party, take power again after the US installed a right-wing Inez, right? She was a dictator installed by the US government. The MAS just took power again under Arce, right? So I think we can safely say that a Biden administration will attempt a coup there again. I do believe that. I think that will happen. I think the same thing will probably be happening all across Latin America. I think you'll see the same thing in Venezuela. You'll probably see assassination attempts, you know, all the way across Colombia. You'll see things get worse. Nicaragua, you'll probably see things get worse, right? Because, you know, domestically, the differences between a Biden and Trump administration, there are a few. But when it comes to international policy, when it comes to sort of US imperialism, I really don't think you're going to see that many differences. I think the first speech that Kamala Harris actually gave was, you know, talking about giving an extra $38 billion of aid to Israel over the next 10 years. I think that comes down to like $10.5 million a day. So you can see that, you know, there is a sort of ingrained international order here with the United States at the head of that. I think, you know, to a degree is on train tracks. I don't think it even, there are some things here that it doesn't matter who sits in the seat, because ultimately the true power structures within the country stay the same, and they're still there. I spoke about this before, you know, the right wing likes to talk a lot about a deep state, and that's too conspiratorial, but I do think they're kind of onto something, but I don't call it a deep state, I call it a permanent state. What I mean by this is just simply people at the NSA and the CIA and the FBI, right? These are people that are not elected. They outlive individual presidents. And some of the people at the heads of those institutions have been there 20, 30, 40 years. So I think that's where the real power base is within those institutions. I don't even know how much power rests in the Oval Office.
But even then, those individuals are still just puppets to an ideology, predominantly, you know, capitalist liberalism.
Yeah, no doubt. The thing here is that, you know, I think this is why you're always going to see a trend towards the sort of worst elements of US imperialism. And it's the idea that, you know, any of these heads of the NSA, CIA, etc., can take all of their plans. And if they, let's take the heads of the NSA, CIA, etc., under Obama, they probably had a load of plans and a load of things that they wanted to do, but Obama wouldn't approve because of the sort of personality aspect of who he was. So, you know, the heads of those agencies can just sit on those plans. They can just sit on the plans for 4 years, 8 years until a new president comes in. You know, Trump, suddenly they take them to Trump and all of them get passed. Right? This is why you'll always see a slide towards the most sort of barbaric and destructive elements of US imperialism, because ultimately, you know, the corporations and capitalism will always benefit from it. They always want it. That's why I think you'll see coup attempts under the Biden administration also, because, you know, those material pressures are still there. They still want the natural resources. They still want governments in Latin American companies that are favorable to US imperialism. And they will still do anything to meet those ends.
What you've just said there about Obama not doing something because that doesn't fit his character profile ties into exactly my response to the Marxist project when he said that under the Biden presidency he's going to be overtly less oppressive to the left. And that's true because, you know, Donald Trump ran off the idea of being overtly fascist. And he's running off the idea of being like overtly towards the left, whether he is or not. That's what he's running off. Both of these play the same role for capital and bourgeois democracy, but it is interesting and I do think intentional that more than ever, the United States needs a president who is cracking down less on the left right now because of how popular, say, Marxism, leftism, anarchism, you know, all of that is on the left right now. You're both right, and those are interesting observations. And going back to trying to picture like a United States and America with socialist characteristics, and this not being a popular enough discussion on the left in general or comrades in the United States, that's definitely true because at one time in the United States there were Marxist intellectuals out there and just people producing theory. We went over William Z. Foster's Towards Soviet America on a Theory Thursday episode, didn't we, Ryan? And that's an outstanding piece of theory that does talk about, you know, a Soviet United States, and I think that that's something that you comrades should engage with more and, you know, try and apply, you know, that text and see what you could bring out and what would work, what sounds interesting, you know, come out with these good ideas and these visions. And this is why Che Guevara was so impressive, Fidel Castro, you know, Malcolm X, all of these people were visionaries. They pictured the future, and we can't really do that being over in the UK. What we can do is hopefully encourage, even if it's not something like us as comrades can like implement. It's definitely something that, again, we have to do when we have to start and building these ideas and inspiring others. Yeah, just a few more thoughts there. Have you got anything you want to throw in there as a response, Mark, to this project?
Yeah, I mean, really, I just agree. I really agree with that. I feel like the left is kind of in its infancy again, especially in the United States. Like you said, there were times where there was a lot of productive activity going on the left here, but we're kind of cycling back because there was a fallout. You know, we lost a lot of traction for the past several decades, and we're kind of coming back now. And I think there's a natural tendency to first get our bearings, you know, to understand the theory and really sort of refine our critique of capitalism. And I think that's good and needs to continue to happen because, you know, there's never enough refinement that could happen in that particular area. But sooner rather than later, I think we do need to focus on the creative elements of leftism, sort of envisioning a future beyond capitalism and, you know, not just drawing on the visions of the past, which were in their own sense quite spectacular, but sort of developing something new for the conditions that we find ourselves in, because some of it will work, some of it will not, and we need to adapt. And I think even rhetorically speaking, when you're conversing with someone about leftism, you'll eventually, if you convince them on the whole critique of capitalism element, run into the question of, okay, well, what do we do next? And the left just needs to have more answers for that, I feel like.
Let me get in here a second, because you're more correct than you know, right? So I talk about this idea a lot, and I call it, the politics of the anti. So it's the idea that, because of, capitalist realism has restricted our imagination such that everyone knows what they're against, but very few people actually know what they're for, right? Very few people actually know what they're building and working towards. But it's very easy to be against something, right? So whenever you see, protest signs or slogans or whatever, it's always, I'm against this, right? They're either anti-abortion, anti-tax, anti-mask, right? It's always framed around what they're against instead of what they're actually for.
Yeah, absolutely.
I love that politics at the anti because, yeah, it is so true. I mean, you look up any electoral politics, that's all they talk about. If the Labour, they're talking about why the Tories are so bad, the Tories say one thing, you know what I mean? They just throw it back and say, and it's the exact same thing. The Democrats literally run off not being Republicans, and the Republicans run off like not being Democrats. Every single 4 years, it's just this cycle. It's because people don't believe that they can achieve anything. So why would they be for anything if they're not that inspired that they can do something? But what they can do is be against something and complain, because as you've said in the past, it's so easy to complain about something. It's so much easier to throw a tantrum whenever you're upset, and people are upset because they're frustrated, they're angry, they're confused. It's a lot harder to, again, have hope to, or even the time to invest in achieving anything in your life, because we're so alienated from everything, and that includes education and information. That's why what you're doing with your YouTube channel is so important. That's why we're grateful to be speaking to you now, and that's why we encourage you to keep it up. And yeah, it'll be great to see how these ideas develop, because all of this is new. All of this, I just put up all of these podcasts, all of these, leftists on YouTube. It's all new. We don't know what it's going to achieve over 10, 20, 30 years when hopefully we're as old as Marx and we're producing content. What's that going to look like? We're marching towards progress, and every single one of us should be engaging again in this education and class struggle.
I was going to say, I also just think there's something sort of innate, or no, I don't want to get too philosophical, but I think there's just something more fun ultimately about knowing what you're against or destroying something. I think of what's more fun, to build a sandcastle on a beach, or just to run and kick one, right? It's just way more fun to run and kick one. I think there's something about destruction. It's just a little bit more fun. So knowing what you're against, it sort of, draws people, but you really do ultimately have to build and actually work towards something better. You can't just ultimately base your whole ideology on, I'm not that, right?
I mean, what's mostly ironic about all of this is I'm a Marxist because I'm anti-capitalist. So I don't know what I am more. Am I a more anti-capitalist, or am I more communist? I don't know, but one thing's for sure is people are dying, people are getting blown up, people are suffering, people are getting tortured in Guantanamo Bay, people are living in poverty, they're living out on the streets, they're living with, flipping disabilities, they're being alienated from society, from social structures, from social interactions. I mean, the miserable people committing suicide. It's a hard world out here, and it's because of capitalism. That's one thing I know for sure. But us as Marxists and, this ideology of historical materialism, that's important to make sure that we're not being dogmatic. So it's not just that I'm against capitalism, it's that I'm a dialectician, and I can see from a scientific point that this is the cause to all of the problems, and which are just, expressed there. That's why it's so important to engage in these theories and these texts and produce our own, because we have to teach each other. School is not going to teach us this. They don't want us to know this. So with that said, we'll move on to how other leftists are producing content and what that's doing for the class struggle and education and class consciousness of the proletariat overall. So I just thought, because there's a lot of taste for BreadTube YouTubers and a lot of left-wing creators on platforms like YouTube, with them being labeled as liberals, opportunists, and generally reactionary, and some of them are even being, I don't want to name names, but obviously, well, in fact, I'll name one, Roge. Some of these are seen as being harmful to Marxism, socialism, or unity in general, with many socialists on these platforms, for example, condemning, and who was it, Thought Slam done it recently, condemned, and he turned mass that hundreds of thousands of people against like Marxism and Marxists labeling this as like tankies being, and sectarian. So like, have you given this like phenomenon of like BreadTube and those YouTube creators like any thought? Like, do you think that like BreadTube is like in the long run like a force for good in the proletariat struggle, or do you feel that it's ultimately like negative and something to push back on with like in the form of like statements, education, better content in them, or like educating these creators directly? I know that there's a few questions there, but like I'd love to hear like any announcements you've got on these frustrations to some people, but educational tools for others.
Yeah, I will say firstly that I wish I was more acquainted with BreadTube. Over the years, I've watched more content and followed more creators, but I'm not as well versed on all of the discourse that's going on there, and I really don't follow it as much as I do, really as much as I should, mostly because I just don't find myself having the time. But in terms of like, I am familiar with this tension of should we sort of be careful about the kind of content that's being put out because it could be potentially harmful, or it could misinform people who are trying to learn the theory earnestly. And I think generally my approach is that the more content there is, the better, even if some of the content is not necessarily as well thought out or researched, or maybe it even misinterprets some of the source material that it's talking about, as is the case, with some of the BreadTubers who are explicitly anti-Marxist or whatever. But I think that, again, because we're in this formative stage, as we've been talking about, where we're sort of starting out building a loose network, I guess, especially with the way that YouTube works with its algorithm. You watch one video and it's hauntingly good at predicting what else you may be interested in watching. And I know that it tells me that a lot of my viewers come from other channels, like the Gravel Institute, for example, just launched their own project. And I know it's been met with some criticism because it's not sufficiently leftist. And it's true that it does have it's strategically decided to position itself closer to the center than to the left compared to some of the other left tubers and leftist YouTube channels in general. But I think that it has a valuable space in this sort of loose network or confederation of creators, because it opens a discourse. And I think that as a network, we're engaging in a constantly productive exercise, that we're producing the narrative and rebuilding it and tearing it apart, and sort of refining it as we go. And to the degree that maybe we find that some people's content is limiting or inaccurate, I think that's where you can come in and make, response videos or offer criticism. And, I fundamentally don't believe that there is, that it's really possible or worthwhile, especially within the context of leftist tendencies, to definitively prove one position or the other as more correct or closer to Marx or more accurate to our current circumstances. I think that there's value in exploring all of the possibilities, whether they're Marxist or not. And especially in those like fault lines, in those areas of tension between different tendencies, is often where we are able to refine our own positions and better understand what it is that we're arguing for, or what it is that we generally support. So I think that tension is necessary. I think that the volume is necessary too, of like building a place on YouTube or in other online spaces where leftist content is just there, and viewers and people who are interested in learning about this stuff, they have a place to go to watch things and at least start thinking about them and be exposed to some kind of argument. Yeah, so I think I lean more on the side of positive than negative, even though I do have disagreements with some of the content creators in terms of their interpretations, but I don't think that those are, unhealthy or should get in the way of the broader picture, I guess.
Yeah, good points there. I'm glad that you raised the question about the Gravel Institute, because I've been asked about that lately, and that does genuinely seem like a good institution. And I mean, we talk about how Bernie Sanders would be better than America, but I truly believe like the Gravel Institute would be a lot better alternative for Americans and definitely inspiring. But as to how likely the Gravel Institute could become the dominant institution of the United States, I don't know like how that could happen really. But as positive as that would be, but again, as long as people are working towards progress, that's something we have to support, as well as at the same time educating ourselves so that we can better educate them and then flip them, maybe turn them a bit more radical. So
Right.
when you're seeing YouTubers producing not maybe the most scientific socialist ideas out there, and maybe response videos being better to call them out when they're not correct. That's good. That's important. You do see that a lot, actually. Especially like there's a YouTuber out there who does like amazing YouTube videos of like all the PragerU videos that you see, because they're like one of the most disgusting propaganda networks for like the United States out there. But like the response videos that they do debunking all those videos are definitely important for just truth, for people's understanding of what world we're actually living in, because so much of it is misinformation, and that's why you see, even people on the far right knowing for a fact that the mass media is a load of lies and it's a load of confusion, and that's true. It just doesn't have to be because of the conspiracies that they're believing. So all of these YouTubers, these bedtubers, although they can get some slack and there can be arguments on both sides of Twitter about these platforms, it is always positive to engage with negative aspects of anything. I think that it's right for people to criticize them, and I also think that it's important because it's a part of combating liberalism. But if people don't criticize or call out what's wrong, then we're never going to get to the truth. And this is a process. This is a brand new phenomena of YouTube videos, left-wing videos. We're making history. And so all of us, again, it's our duty, I think, as like a virtual vanguard, to comment on videos, to, if they're good, support them. If you disagree with some things, leave a comment on the video and engage with the creator. Or even if the creator never actually gets back to you, your comment's there for people to see and engage with your thoughts on that. I mean, you see it all the time. People can spend days arguing with each other on Reddit, going back and forth. But like, again, it's never an argument just between two people. There's like thousands of people coming along and seeing these discussions, and we have to value that as this is like education that us as proletarians are doing amongst ourselves to educate ourselves. So again, that's why I emphasize, and we're not just saying subscribe, like, upvote, share it. We're not just saying it again out of like ego and like self-validation, and we're just hooked on dopamine from upvotes and comments. No, it's about education, and it's about building a future together. And that's, again, why I emphasize on everybody who's listening now or will be listening in the future. We'll always speak to you. We'll always get you on a podcast. We'll engage with anything you want. If you want to engage with a certain theory, let us know. We'll do the theory and we'll educate it again, get that out, and then you can spread that on your social media so that you can inspire people locally and yourself. That's what it's about. That's what's important. We're not trying to waste our breath here. But some people are doing it out of opportunism and, being reactionary, and this synthetic left as well. We had Caleb on the show talking about this synthetic left, and that's real. There's a lot of counter propaganda out there, and it's our duty to counter cultural hegemony, to counter this propaganda that's out there. Have you got any reflections on that? And in fact, I'll ask you a direct question, like, is there any advice that you would say to people who would like to maybe start producing some content, or like, how would you encourage them to do that?
Two things. One kind of goes back a little bit. One of the most influential books for me that I read this year was Pedagogy of the Oppressed, and I can't recommend it enough to everyone. It's very short and very beautifully written. It's by Paulo Freire. I did a video on it, and it doesn't do it any justice. It was like a brief overview. And to me, one of the points that stuck out a lot was the mode of engagement that he talks about when it comes to education and sort of like interacting, exchanging ideas. And he basically develops this thesis that education in the conventional sense is very top down. You know, you have a teacher who in the conventional, especially like liberal society, is seen as the holder of the information, and the student as sort of an empty bank that information is deposited into. And you have like this unilateral, non-dialectic relationship where there's a one who knows and one who doesn't, and the transfer of information is not horizontal at all. And I think that is not just true in terms of like, you know, political education across spectrums, but even like internally with leftists. You know, there's a tendency to come into a conversation viewing yourself as the teacher and not as a student, or a teacher student, which is what Freire talks about, is the idea of being both at the same time, and the idea of learning and teaching and learning, and how two or however many number of people are engaging in a discussion, preferably more, I think they're teaching and learning. And I think we as leftists need to understand that and sort of internalize that. And when we interact with each other, when we're having conversations and when we're having disagreements, especially, it can be really challenging to go into an argument or a conversation acknowledging that I may have something to learn from this, even if I think that this is entirely wrong. And you have to, you know, it's a trained thing, because we're trained in the top-down method of exchange, right? Of the deposit method, and we need to sort of come out of that and become more horizontal and collective in our development of ideas and theory. And the second point, with regard to making content, I think, like I said, it's good to have more content in general. And the caveat to that, and my advice to people, I guess, is to make content about what you know. So, you know, if your interest is like film, right, or video games, or something, you know, something that you're knowledgeable in, that you can also, you know, present in like a novel, sort of Marxist or leftist of any kind of perspective, that's what you should focus on, at least to start with. And you know, this is something that I struggle with, honestly, all the time, because I always have this imposter syndrome sentiment of like, I don't know enough about this subject to talk about it. But to the degree that it's possible, adhere to the things that you're most familiar with, because that's where you're probably going to have the most success in sort of developing not your own understanding, but also helping others understand whatever it is that you're teaching about. And I think venturing beyond that is good and very important. But to do that, to, you know, make content on something new that you're not familiar with, I would encourage taking the time to familiarize yourself with it before you go into it. And that's part of my process in general, is before I make content, I normally read, like, you know, a book on it at least, or articles, or, you know, as much literature as I could fit within my schedule to, you know, at least say that, okay, I've read enough stuff here that I can summarize what I've read for people who maybe haven't read it. And that's really, I mean, it's really, that's all it is in terms of like making content. And yeah, that's really my biggest advice, is make content about what you know about or what you've read about, because yeah, it'll mitigate the potential for misinformation.
Bosh points.
Yeah, so it was on BreadTube, right? So the first thing I want to make sure we're not doing is misjudging the size of the problem, right? Like if I'm not super familiar with BreadTube. I've seen, you know, a couple videos from a couple of people, but I don't want to make a huge issue out of it if it's not a big issue, right? And even though there are people out there that are, you know, an issue, right? There, opportunists exist, revisionists exist, right? And we should, you know, definitely engage in ideological struggle with them at all times. There's no doubt about it. But I don't want the left to become a sort of, you know, group of people that sits around and sips the tea all day. You know what I mean? Like there's work to be done and stuff to achieve, and
like the anti-BreadTube politics of the anti-business.
Right, yeah. I mean, you don't want to just become a place that just talks about how bad BreadTube is, right?
and with that response there to the Marxist project on education and educating others from that book and how to educate others. So I just wanted to share my thoughts, and I mentioned this earlier. What we're talking about isn't just education for the sake of education or just teaching for the sake of education. It's not, again, we're not trying to flex like some kind of intellectual prowess over nothing. It's nothing like that. What it is, it's learning historical materialism. It's learning dialectical materialism. And what this is a tool it's a scientific tool so that we can better analyze society and society's development and the development of social structures. And we look at the base, the superstructure, we analyze, again, history and other class struggle, because history is directed by class struggle. And we know this through historical materialism, just as Charles Darwin shown us the theory of evolution. This is just, a material foundation of your environment shapes not just you as a species through evolution, but the materials actually shape us as a social creatures and a social force and social groups. And capitalists know this. Ryan's always said that, the capitalists are like the greatest Marxists in the world because they know how to control us by the means of capital and wealth and using work and our labor hours and all of this to dominate what we think, how we think, our culture, and make us better wage slaves. I mean, that's just a fact. So what we're doing by engaging in education is learning how to better refine this tool to see the world in which we're living in. We're trying to find the truth against the world of lies and misinformation from the media, from our schools, from churches telling us all of this about religion. All we are brains in skulls that's like evolved to have consciousness out of the Big Bang, made of atoms spinning around in a galaxy that's spinning around in the universe. We're just grey matter in a skull. We don't actually know anything. All we have are senses, eyes, tongue, smell, hearing. We only have our senses. And Marxism is the sense to make sense of the world. It's like seeing it as like a sixth sense. It shows us the truth, just as like you can hear somebody shout at you. You can hear what they've said, but because of the thought process that went on in your mind, you've just misheard that because you were thinking of something else, or because there was a noise in the background. You heard what they said, but you also heard the noise in the background, and this noise overwhelmed what you were trying to listen to. But Marxism tells you that if you want to hear what's being said over this loud noise in the background, this noise, we can see that as being Facebook, we can see that as being CNN, NBC, all of these bourgeois propaganda news outlets, the New York Times. That's just this extra noise. But Marxism tells us that if we want to hear what's actually being said, then we have to think differently. And we have to think differently by putting a cup around our ear, by putting a hand around our ear to block out all of this excess noise so that we can actually hear what this person's saying to us. But to hear them, we have to think differently. Rather than just listen to everything that's coming in, we have to think differently to put it over our ears so that we can hear them. That's materialism. It's knowing that to hear the truth, to see the truth, we have to make material change. We have to think differently. That's why it's an ideology, because it's how we think about this world. It's how we analyze the world through this scientific method that allows us to see the truth. Because we only have our senses, we're limited by them. So it's up to us to engage in this philosophy. So that's why the education is important. It's not just a fun activity. It's not just a hobby that we like reading about Marxism. We're trying to make sense of the world.
Yeah, I mean, that's why I end my all of my videos with 11th thesis from Theses of Feuerbach. About the point of philosophy is to actually change the world. And I think that's where Marxism sort of stands out from some of the other intellectual traditions. And it's certainly, I hope, what the point of education is for Marxists who engage with it. So yeah, I agree completely.
Definitely.
Yeah, there's that saying, right? It's like theory without practice is impotent. Practice without theory is blind, right? I mean, theory is only useful insofar as it directs correct action.
So going back to what you said there, the Marxist project, and we are nearly towards the end now, towards the Q&A section, but I just want to respond to this because it was important. When you said how important it is for people to educate others on things that they know about, well, that ties into what we're doing in Revolutionary Lumpen Radio. Me, myself, have been Lumpen for many years. I've slang more of the most potent, dank merch in my city. I've been there, I've done that, I've lived that flipping thug life, you know what I'm saying? I know what it's like for them lumpen pros out there who are never going to get a job. They're never going to be working class. They're unemployable and they just don't want to work for the capitalist and be a wage slave, and they make a lot more money doing otherwise. We've done episodes lately with like sex workers and this phenomenon of like, are they actually sex workers? Should we support them? Should we not? But these are being kicked out of their Marxist revolutionary organizations because of that. So what we're trying to do is bring or show revolutionary potential in the lumpen proletariat. Obviously, Malcolm X himself was lumpen proletariat. He used to sell joints, and his best mate was a pimp. It said that like he'd probably done a bit of pimping in his time. Even the Black Panther Party organised with gangsters and got support from, their local gangsters. It's important that all proletarians come together. So I wanted to, so when I done this and started it up, it was to show potential, not just in the lumpen proletariat through me, but also with the guests who we bring on an interview and show what they're doing for the international proletarian struggle and just how loving and empathetic they are to fellow human beings, whilst at the same time we are being ostracized from revolutionary organizations because we might have drug problems, we might, have mental health problems, or we might just make organizations look bad. All of these things are real. So we wanted to bring that out to people, and that, that's all I'll say on it really. And I'll leave that open to any questions that people have got at the end. Really important that people focus on what they're good at, and then even if you're just a cool person to watch a film with, a movie with, and you might be fun and you might talk at the right bit and make people laugh, that's a good quality. So you can always give your opinion on films. Mark Fisher done that a lot in Capitalist Realism, didn't he? He reflected on TV shows and films and talked about his analysis. And again, you might be somebody who really likes music and it's good to listen to music too. You can produce some kind of content where you're just listening and talking about music. That's all good. We're all comrades out here. It's always good to find people who are good to chill with and watch things with together, and that's part of building communities. And the best thing about doing this podcast was the friends that we've gained along the way. And connections, and we catch up with all of our guests from time to time. We love them all, obviously, genuinely love here for all of our comrades, love for all you for listening, and again, supporting other comrades in the server. This is important what we're doing. So with that being said, we'll just finish up on an outro from you, the Marxist Project, and then we'll go into Q&A.
Well, I just want to thank you and thank the International Leftist Library for making this happen. I think this is a really productive and engaging discussion. And I'm always happy to do things like this. So just as further reference, if any of you want to do anything like this again, I'm very open to doing it. And I encourage everyone who's listening or will be listening to, like you said, to do similar things, to work on the kinds of things that they're capable of working on. And yeah, I think that's how we will be able to grow as a movement or a tendency, or however you'd like to call it. So yeah, again, I very much appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you, International Leftist Community. Thank you, Marxist Project. I've enjoyed this. This was great. we're down for this whenever. Just let us know. Again, we're down for it whenever with whoever. It's so important what we're doing here. So we always have a guest sign off with like some plugs, like just asking where can people follow you, find your work, and where can you be found on social media, anywhere you do want to be found on like any of these platforms. Is there any organizations that you think people should go and check out? Any of that would be like hugely appreciated, and we'll make sure that it's in our show notes for our podcast so people can come and support you just as you've supported us in this project as well.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I encourage people to join the International Leftist Library. I think it's a very useful resource for people who are learning. There's so much content here. It's incredibly worthwhile to be a part of the server. And of course, also follow Revolutionary Lumpen Radio. I think that your content is very meaningful and it's so easy to listen to. I was just listening to it for a few hours earlier, and yeah.
Oh, thanks.
Both of those places, please check them out. As far as myself, or rather, I don't know, myself may not be the best term there, but the Marxist Project can be found on YouTube primarily. You could probably just search it into the search bar and you'll find it. And then there's a Twitter account that's supposed to be more active. It's not super active. I maybe go on there like once every few weeks. I'd like to make it more active, but I just don't have the time. And beyond that, I don't really have any social media spaces. But if you want to reach out to me in terms of, helping with the channel, maybe contributing your capabilities like writing a script or helping with editing or animation or whatever it is, you can reach me at themarxistproject@gmail.com. I very much welcome anyone's contributions in any capacity. A lot of people have helped me grow this channel in a lot of different ways, and I'm very thankful to all of them. And I guess if that's something that you have the ability to do and you're interested in doing, I do have a Patreon. And of course, all of my patrons' contributions have been really, really helpful too. As someone who struggles financially and struggled financially even more at the beginning of last year, that kind of contribution went a long way to keeping the channel going and allowing me to make better content. So, yep, those are my plugs.
Oh yeah, the struggle is real. I'm telling you. Patreon support will go a long way. We would 1,000,000% produce better content with more support. And what we want to do is get to a point where, like, if we have like enough money, we can rent out a base in the city centre so that we can actually base build and then have our comrades living there and live and breathe in revolution 24/7. This is a dream that we're going to start towards. So we'll just sign off. Again, thank you. Where you can find us is our website, lumpen.libsyn.com, or you can find us at patreon.com/lumpenpodcast. We have a Twitter as well, at lumpen_radio. So yeah, please follow us on all of them. We'll engage. If you do give us some feedback, that's an easy way to gain yourself a retweet. But no, seriously, we love engaging with people. And getting support. It's really great to know that people do find where you spend a lot of time on and energy. It's good to know that people find that valuable, and we really hope that people have found this valuable. So with that being said, we'll go into Q&A.
All right, so what we'll do for the Q&A is, if you do have a question, please first type it in the VC discussion channel. And then you will be unmuted once it's your turn. Also, if you cannot VC, then add a short notice that you cannot VC before your question, so that we won't waste time reading it out. With that being said, the first question comes from Exiled Monkey, so I'm going to unmute them.
Hello, Exiled Monkey.
Cool. What's up? So my question is just a quick one, directed at whoever wants to answer. Has the US done anything good in the 20th and 21st century? Not good, obviously subjective, so whatever you consider for the movement.
My quick thought on that would be the US as an institution, definitely not, because the US is a bourgeois dictatorship. I'm talking about the US as a state. The individuals of the United States have done a lot of good things. There's a lot of good things that people do every single day that they don't have to do, whether that's just being a good neighbor, whether that's just being thoughtful. These are all important things in the world, and the people generally are good. The people support each other all the time. You see this through mutual aid. You see this through food banks. I don't know if you've got them in the United States. The people do try and be good when they can, and they don't have to. And there's a lot of things like even doctors, nurses, teachers out there who are working, going above and beyond just out of the love and of the fellow human beings. But as for the state itself and the state institutions that the United States is, definitely not. It's a force of evil. It's one of the most evil, destructive, parasitic things in the entire world. Death to America.
Yeah, it's hard to follow. But I think, there should be a separation between the United States as a political institution and, America in a more broad sense, because of course there have been a lot of positive movements that have come out of the United States in the 20th and 21st century. I mean, you've got the movements of the 60s and 70s, which gave birth to a lot of leftist tendencies, leftist thought, both in academia and outside of academia. The Occupy Wall Street movement in the post-2008 recession period. So there's a lot of influential events and groups and institutions within the United States that have done, I think, positive things, especially in terms of developing, the leftist movement abroad. But I would say, in terms of the role that the United States has had, it's been overwhelmingly negative on a global sense, and maybe only negative in the domestic sense, in the sense that, I guess, like, marginally speaking, certain policies, especially in the middle of the 20th century, were by force geared towards limited sort of welfare, which is, I wouldn't say negative, but it's not, it's insufficient. So there's not much positive to say about it other than it should have been there in the first place, and now it's not even there anymore. So, yeah.
Yeah, let me just define good and bad here, right? So I think this is fairly universal among Marxists. I mean, I define good, that which brings us closer to proletarian revolution, and bad, like that which inhibits or, prevents proletarian revolution, right? So from this standpoint, then the US would not have done anything good in those centuries, because, every nation, every country, you can find the United States backing, arming, supporting enemies of proletarian revolution, enemies of true Marxist socialist movements. So I definitely have to say that they've not done anything good from that point of view. But if you want to use, good and bad in sort of a more generic sense, then, even a stopped clock's right twice a day, right? So I imagine, even by chance, they must have done something somewhere that wasn't totally bad. But, make no mistake that, the US imperial order is headed by the United States, right?
Right, so if that's everything, the next question comes from Feasting on Dobbs. They asked, what is the potential for revolution in imperialist core nations, and what is the role of leftists in these nations?
The question here is essentially talking about third worldism. Right. So the idea here is that, is the quote unquote first world proletariat actually equipped to attack the imperial core from inside the imperial core, right? Or are we dependent on, people waging protracted people's war or something like that in quote unquote third world nations, right? And I go back and forth on this question. Sometimes I feel one way, some days I feel the other way. I think what you have to understand is that, we're living at a time where propaganda has never been stronger. It's never been more hegemonic. The reach of the United States has never been, everywhere. So I think, revolutionary potential of the first world proletariat, so to speak, is diminished. Does that mean it's impossible or can't be achieved or is, no hope at all? It doesn't, for sure. It's just going to take more effort and, a sort of more laser beam focus on where we should be looking and should be acting. There's another question fairly close to this later on, which I really want to talk about because me and Shibi were talking about this yesterday. But I think the problem is when you look at, the sort of first world proletariat within nations like the United States and the United Kingdom, I just don't see so much true revolutionary potential there. But if you look to sort of what they call the global south or Latin America, etc., they have much more active, much more virulent, true left movements. So I don't think it's a sort of ideological question. I see it as a purely practical question of where in the world are the Marxist movements with the most chance for success, right? And I see just more of them today in what they call the global south. But that doesn't mean it's always going to be that way. And it doesn't mean it has to be that way. It just tends to be how things are today.
Yeah, I like that point at the end about sort of rejecting the universality of the conditions. I think that to sort of attribute a particular characteristic in the global position to one country or another, I think that it misses out on, the fact that these circumstances change over time. And I think, for example, like in the United States, the potential for a more powerful leftist movement is sort of expanding and growing today in comparison to the last several decades, especially since the 90s, which is not to say necessarily that revolution in the traditional sense is surely going to happen, but the movement alone could become a sufficient force in terms of influence and cooperation with other movements around the world. And I think now more than ever, this sort of coordination, this transnational coordination between different types of leftists in different parts of the world is more achievable. And I think that even if in the United States there are a lot of seemingly insurmountable obstacles for a complete transformation of society, within our lifetime, that doesn't mean that there can't be a powerful, organization and movement here that could lend hands, to its neighbors in the South or to the East, to the West, So, yeah, I think that that's what we should be, in the practical sense, what we should be more focused on is what potential exists, and focus on that more than can we get to any kind of terminal end stage from here.
I absolutely agree with both of you. Additionally, my thoughts would be to add on to your response and say, when we ask ourselves what potentials are there and then plan around that, the question in itself is entirely and extremely deeply philosophical. And it's philosophical because we can't see the future. We can use scientific materialism to make a prediction. We can use philosophy to make a prediction. But ultimately, as we say, I think Thomas Sankara talks about this when he talks about building realities and potential futures. This is what we do with our life force, with our energy. When we shape the world through materialism and our labor, we're creating a new reality. It's never happened before. We're creating a new universe out of our free will. Whether you argue about whether we've got one or not, but I think we're creating new realities. So insofar as is there going to be a revolution in imperialist countries, firstly, we have to recognize that each country is going to be different. That's why I asked about socialism with American characteristics earlier, because each country is going to be different. So maybe a protracted People's War would work somewhere else. Maybe sometimes they need this dual power to come into play, and then moving through the electoral politics. We don't know. One thing we do know is the future's up to us and our life force, and you have to ask yourself that question: and how much of your energy and your life force and your will you're willing to put into the revolution? Are you going to be at it all the time? Are you going to agitate all the time? Are you going to educate all the time? Or are you going to martyr yourself? All of these things are things that could happen. We don't know which one is the right answer. We can't know what's the right answer. All we can do is try to make the most informed decisions that make sense through understanding dialectical materialism, to increase the chances of a better world. We don't know, but one thing's for sure is it is up to us. We talked about this earlier, as Ryan said, in the Philippines with the MPA and their struggle. They could defeat imperialism out of their country, but imperialism will continue throughout Latin America, throughout the Middle East. But if we knocked it out of the belly of the beast in imperial countries, imperialism would cease all around the world. So it's the solution to the end of imperialism, but whether the practice of like an armed rebellion in the United States is the correct one, we just do not know. I think it's worth a try.
The next two questions will come from Grax.
Hello,
Yes,
can you hear
we can.
me? So I've listened to you and listened to many leftists say this common argument. I think Marxist Project mentioned that. So my question would be, will leftist organizing be actually better under Biden? Because the more I research this topic, I just still can't find an answer. It seems that it's just not true, or someone's hiding something from me. Can you explain your views?
Can I just ask you a follow-up question on why do you think that that's not true? And then that can help us explain a better answer for you.
Well, I guess because leftist organizing is not something that is being done, like it was suppressed usually historically throughout the whole history. So if you have two guys that represent the same thing, just one of them is, I guess, of a different taste, then how would this be different if they would suppress anything that like hurts them, their interest and stuff? Just, I guess, in a different manner.
Yeah.
But that's for one. And for two, the whole lesser evil thing is a nonsense, but it's a different topic. I just need to listen about organizing, because maybe you'll tell me something new, and maybe this is actually a lesser evil point that actually exists.
Yeah, I mean, I think as someone based here in the U.S., I think there's an obvious truth to us people who are perceiving this from a Marxist lens, that there structurally is not going to be a lot of difference between Biden and Trump. And just historically speaking, from one administration to another, there are not necessarily a lot of upheavals and changes. I think like in the 20th century, you could maybe point to some administrations that were very effective in passing specific types of policies and legislations that were either positive or negative. Like you could look at Reagan and say that he was very effective at deconstructing a lot of labor protections and a lot of regulations on the market. And that was a pivotal moment that his administration heavily influenced. And then you could say maybe the same of his predecessors, who did put in place certain labor protections and regulations against the market. And I think that acknowledgement is necessary. And I do think that in understanding those distinctions and those historical moments, we can maybe draw some differences between Biden and Trump. Of course, the difficulty here is that we're still speculating because we don't actually know what Biden will do yet. And given his sort of interest in saying whatever will get him the most support, it's really difficult to pinpoint what it is that he'll actually end up doing. And I like you pointed out, I think that it's quite possible that he may do many of the things that have been done in the past by administrations of different kinds of persuasions in terms of like American politics. But the reason why I said that it may be easier to organize under Biden is really more like in the negative sense that it may be harder to organize under Trump. And that's because of the kinds of statements that the Trump administration has made that specifically use language that paints the left in a very negative sense. And of course, like, centrist Democrats have a tendency to do this as well. But the way in which they approach this issue is, in my opinion, different enough that it becomes a different reality for us on the left, because Trump, and the people who are loyal to him in the executive right now are have said in the past just year, things like anti-fascism is terrorism, which is a very different message from the one that the Biden campaign has put out. Now, the Biden campaign has also said that, it denounces any kind of protests that are not like peaceful and abide by the law and order of American society, which is its own sort of conservative element, right? But I think that there's a difference between what Trump has been saying and what Biden has been saying. But, it's still all speculative because we don't know what it'll look like. This is just my thoughts based on the kinds of language that both candidates have used.
Yeah, that Trump ran on being overtly fascist and being against leftists, whereas Biden can't do that because that's not what he was running off. So, I mean, yeah, the two sides of the same coin, but it is just like a PR stunt, isn't it? They're just advertising themselves differently.
Right, so the second question is also from Grax, so go ahead and ask your second question.
Yeah, and it's kind of connected. I guess this would be to Shibi. So, how is Trump exactly fascist, and how he is specifically hurting the left in a way that Biden or Bernie or someone else can't or won't hurt the left?
Okay, so I'm gonna admit to that. You did just call me out there, because I don't think that Trump is fascist. I know that I have said that he is, but what I mean by that is I don't think that he's politically educated enough to even know what fascism is. But what he is somebody who understands or so he's being told, that the fascists love him, and the fascists do love him because his policies have always been against anti-immigration. He's been renowned to be, overtly racist. He is a capitalist, but yeah, he's not overtly, he's not literally a fascist because he's not smart enough to know what it is. He is the person that played the role when the state needed to turn towards fascism. I believe at a time when Bernie Sanders was gaining support, and Bernie Sanders represented like a democratic socialism, and he, in some ways did help spread class consciousness. People understood that he was a ruling class and he was the working class. That differentiation is so important in people's minds for a few of those reasons. Again, he's not overtly fascist, but he's literally just filling in the role for this like WrestleMania entertainment that is, US politics.
Yeah, I could just sort of talk all over this issue for a while. First of all, I don't think I agree with Shibi here on the role that Bernie Sanders played in the left, right? I think he's definitionally an opportunist, right? I mean, these people, they adopt the language and the iconography of revolution, but ultimately his position.
Yeah, sorry, just to defend myself before you carry on, but in the same way that Trump wasn't fascist, but he was running to obviously, so to get the fascist vote, Bernie Sanders isn't like a Marxist or a socialist. I don't think that he understands what any of those things are either. But again, he was running off that vote as well as a good person that he might be, you know, to the extent that an imperialist can be. But go on, sorry, Ryan.
No, I just think that, those kind of people, ultimately what they do is they adopt the language and iconography of revolution, and then they, sheepdog people into a sort of bourgeois electoral system, right? And I mean, I'm not even going to give Bernie Sanders the credit you are there, right? When you say like he doesn't know what Marxism is. I think he does. I mean, he's been in the Senate, 50 years? He went to the USSR. Like, he's not ignorant, right? Like, he knows what he's doing. He's like 70 or something, right? Like, I would hope that he's been around the block enough to know what these terms actually mean, which is why I have less sympathy for him when he calls himself a socialist, because he knows what he's doing, right? He isn't just this sort of innocent, clueless child wandering through the world unaware of what he's doing, right? Like, he's seen true revolutionary movements in other countries in his lifetime, and he's still adopting the language and iconography of revolution while sheepdogging people into, a bourgeois electoral system, right?
I think that brings the conversation to a more structural point, right? Like, you can be, like, I agree. I think that Bernie Sanders understands leftism better than a lot of other U.S. politicians. And if we believe, like, his biographical past, he used to be even more left than he is now. But the reason that he is the way he is like in the public image is because it's like essentially a strategic calculation for him, that being in the center is really the only place you can be in the United States as a politician. Even if you are like a committed Marxist, you cannot achieve the kind of political success that Bernie Sanders has achieved without doing the kind of opportunistic strategies that he's employed. And I think that's the real answer to this question in general, is just that the system frames all of the individual actors in it more so than the individual actors have an influence on framing the system. So yeah, whether or not Bernie is a true socialist revolutionary, which I think for most of us the answer is definitely not, it's besides the point, because he just simply can't be. It's antithetical to the political structures in the United States. It wouldn't ever really work.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that also, right? Which is why bourgeois, Democrat or bourgeois elections are, definitionally the graveyard for revolutionary potential, right? Because you simply would not be allowed to exist there.
All right, so the next question comes from Capra, who is unable to read the question live. So the question is, thoughts on ongoing people's wars, like the one in the Philippines? How can people from other countries, like the US, better support people's wars and revolutionary struggles today?
Do you want to fire first, though, Ryan? Because I know you've got thoughts on this.
Yeah, for sure. I think everyone should support, CPP, MPA for sure. I love them. I watch documentaries on them. They're fantastic. When it sort of comes to providing material support, I'm not even sure how to go about that. And even if I did know how to go about that, I probably would not be telling people in a forum like this how to go about that, right? So, like, I also have a degree in cybersecurity, right? So I know how these things work, right? Like, I have a decent understanding of the global surveillance system that the NSA and the CIA operate under. CPP, MPA, much love to anyone fighting protracted people's war all around the world. Honestly, I think even if you don't consider them, whatever, ideologically pure or any nonsense like that, I will always align myself with that which is the most practical, right? And that's what we should be looking at here. We should be looking at results, right? That which works, we should align ourselves with. We should just come at this from pure pragmatism.
The Marxist Project, have you got any thoughts in the top of your head of that?
Yeah, I mean, I wish I knew more about. I just have such a peripheral knowledge of the issue in the Philippines in particular. But I think to a broader point,
yeah, same.
I think when it comes to these types of movements and what we as outsiders can do, to help is really more from a theoretical perspective of sort of engaging with the people around us and using those scenarios as educational points to transform people's perspectives on anti-imperialist struggles, which are often painted in such a destructive and negative light. And I think that to a degree, that sort of ideology and its effect on public opinions on those movements can have a significant sway on the success of the movements in general. I mean, the international popularity of any movement or struggle does have an influence on its successes. And so I think that when it comes to what can we do in the most immediate and practical sense, it is to educate ourselves on this and push back against the imperialist sort of narrative and the ideologies that are constructed around these movements to make them seem as a particular type of negative element instead of, what they really are, which is, emancipatory struggles.
Yeah, well said, well said. My thoughts on it, again, I don't think I know enough about these struggles to comment enough on it, but what I will say, despite that, is I will give my opinion open, honest, blunt. It's probably not correct, but I am going to say it nonetheless because it's what I think going from the information that I've, picked up. And again, it's important that even though people aren't saying things that are 100% true, these are thoughts that people have. So, if I'm wrong now, that's something that I should be engaged with so that people can educate me better. Me and Ryan were talking about this for quite a bit, actually, yesterday, with regards to the Philippines and the MPA and their struggle comrades in protracted people's war, trying to liberate the Philippines from an actual dictatorship, brutal, violent oppression. I mean, the Palestinians as well, it's all tied together. Anybody who's involved in self-determination, we have to support, especially in the belly of the beast, because they're victims to our country's policies, to their foreign policy, to imperialism. We have to support them so that they know that they're supported by the international community and they're not just going to be victims all their lives. But again, in that same sense that I've already said, then we have to defeat imperialism within the belly of the beast. So I do think that whilst they've got the right to self-determination, I think a lot of the contradictions and lack of support from people on the left towards these armed struggles is because I think that they're probably right in thinking that the necessary struggles, but they're insufficient. So I think that people think that these comrades out there in love and solidarity, these are fighting the actual struggle against imperialism, against like the strongest militaries in the world. Like they're almost throwing their lives away, but what good is it? Like, would you rather live as a slave or die as a free human? That's what it is. It's not bowing down to your oppressor. So we have to support them. We should support them, but we should not rely on them to fight our fights. And it's our fights because they're peaceful. They're not fighting us. We're fighting them. We have to put our fists down. We have to put our weapons down. But instead, we're relying on them to take the weapons from us. Again, I obviously haven't thought about this enough.
I can just fill time here if you want, just responding to chat. So yeah, it's definitely the Philippines is in a crazy situation, but you have to understand that like the contradictions of, US imperialism are directly in their face, right? So a lot of people, inside the imperial core don't really fully understand the violence that, imperialism requires. But if you live in the Philippines, you're under no illusion about this. You see it every day. It's right there. You can't hide from it. I think, the contradictions are just much more raw there. And if protracted people's war is truly the best option, then we should support it, right? I'm again going with pure pragmatism. Whatever works, I'm with that. It's also important to note that, places like the Philippines are incredibly rich when it comes to sort of national resources. I think the last figure I saw was they have something like $1 trillion of untapped natural resources. And that's, you can very quickly see why multinational companies are moving in there very quickly.
And that's the whole point about these poorest nations on the planet, is they're actually not poorest nations on the planet. They're some of the richest nations on the planet. It's just that they're so heavily exploited and all of their material wealth comes out and is extracted through mining or forming peasantries and then taking all the farmers flipping foods through hustles done by Monsanto, and it keeps these countries locked in poverty. And you give them a ruling class who do rule as tyrants and actual dictators, through military coups. These poor countries, people, I have to stress, are some of the richest in the world.
I will also say that I have to support, CPP, MPA, simply because the multinational corporations in the area and the Duterte government themselves admitted that the reason that they haven't been completely successful in what they want to achieve is because of the CPP MPA, right? So what they're doing is practical, it's working, the corporations hate them for it, and that's why they're actively cracking down on them, right? So that just shows that, correct theory applied correctly through correct practice really is the correct way to fight, US imperialism in such countries.
All right, so the next question comes from Malaria Trump.
Okay, great. What are your thoughts about China as a growing imperial power and them reaching enough influence to take in the position to be the upcoming empire to replace America in a sense? Like them being the, in a way, like the next America in a way. Like being such, I don't know. Did you get it?
Yeah, you mean about them becoming the next global superpower, essentially?
Yes.
Yeah. Can we give open and honest answers, and people in our audience appreciate that this is our opinion, this is our analysis, and it may be right, it might be wrong, but these are deep questions that we're all struggling with.
I guess I've been this is such a heated question right now. And I think
that's why I said, please just answer open, honestly, and then hopefully people don't hold any flack against us. It's a difficult question and a controversial one, but at least we're being honest, and all of us here are open to develop our thoughts.
Right, exactly. And for me, I've really only recently started trying to read a little bit more about the situation in China, because in terms of practical knowledge on the way their economy is organized and sort of like their political atmosphere, there's such a complexity there that it's difficult to reduce to a single perspective, I guess, or a single interpretation. And I think that right now, for the time being, is my answer, is that it is difficult to reduce it to, is China capitalist, is China socialist? And for me, the beginning of that answer can be found in parts of volumes 2 and 3 of Capital, where Marx talks about, well, at least hints in implicit and sometimes explicit forms, the ways in which modes of production can coexist, and they're not mutually exclusive. And even the ways in which the capitalist mode of production can use other modes of production to sort of extract surplus value and expand its own enterprises in sort of like a synthetic incorporative manner. So when people are having these debates about, is China capitalist and therefore a future imperial power, or now an imperial power, is China more socialist? Will it become more socialist? I think that the binary is the struggle there. And I think that's it's limiting our discussion, because I think it's entirely possible for there to be socialist elements in China and capitalist elements in China. And even the degrees to which that fluctuates isn't entirely knowable, I guess, because they are abstract concepts, right? And they're very subjective in terms of their definitions. So I think you could easily point to certain elements of China's foreign policy that is pretty clearly capitalist and imperialist in terms of, the export of capital into underdeveloped parts of the world with a very clear sort of accumulation incentive or an accumulation paradigm in the most traditional sense of imperialism from a Marxist perspective. And then you can have the other side of the argument about sort of like the development of productive forces and the capacities that the lengths to which, China goes to actually, build infrastructure. And I think that at least domestically, there can be something to be said about the success and the intentions behind those types of policies. And then beyond that, I just think I need to familiarize myself more with the dynamics of China's capital in other parts of the world and how that affects their domestic policies. And my understanding is that even though it is, to a degree, it is exploitative, it has a fundamentally different dynamic from the kind that we see with sort of the post-Cold War IMF, Western capital influence on third world countries or underdeveloped regions in the world. So yeah, it's distinct in a way, but I wouldn't quite call it a force for good or a force for evil either way.
Mm, yeah, so I mean, I'm also kind of China critical on this. I mean, a lot of support of China I see come from this sort of the enemy of my enemy is my friend type logic. A lot of people tend to support China simply because, US imperialism's out to get China, therefore China must be good. I don't accept that logic generally, but that doesn't mean that, I would side with the imperialists either, because that's obviously not, I don't know, I'll leave it there.
As we've said, it's important that people have a right for self-determination. So if they are truly striving towards socialism, or at least that's what they're claiming to, we do have to keep an open ear to that. It's something that we should do. And again, as anti-imperialists, as Marxist, and we have to support other proletarians in the international global revolution. And there's a good chance that they're being some of the biggest components against capitalism in the world today, and some of the biggest moving towards socialism. But personally, that's what I want. I don't know whether I'm being idealistic about this because I want them to be socialist. But me personally, as you might have heard, I am a radical. I would be for a protracted People's War in the belly of the beast, the UK and the US. For me, it truly blows my mind that a country with as much military capability as China to withstand US military aggression against the world, like they've got carrier killer missiles, they could sink US fleets, they've got nuclear arsenals, so what they could do is send armadas over to Cuba and absolutely smash the blockade on the Cuban people who are socialists today, and then ensure that they can strive and withstand against capitalist embargoes and blockades, and they could liberate Venezuela from the exact same naval blockades, but they don't do this. And whenever I mention this to comrades, people are always telling me, Shibby, you're crazy, you're going to start a new world war, you're going to get us all nuked. But at the same time, the people are already dying, people are getting blown up because of capitalism, because of imperialism. I mean, look at the MPA. These are dying, fighting imperialism. It's already happening. This war is class war. We're already engaged with it. So when there's countries out there who are socialist or claim that they're anti-imperialist and they're not actively fighting against the United States, it boggles my mind. I couldn't do it if I happened to be a head general in the flipping People's Liberation Army of the United Kingdom. Yeah, would absolutely smash naval blockades for all socialists all around the world, and I would absolutely nuke US navies all around the world so that they can't impose, sorties on Libya and flipping and Syria and just, the Middle East and all of this for the exploitation. We have to fight them. So if I was truly socialist and I had a nation that was socialist, we're not just going to sit in our country and develop ourselves as actual Marxists. We have to fight imperialism globally. So to see somebody not do that, that's ultimately the biggest fundamental thing that makes me question whether they're socialist or not. But at the same time, that could be because I could be some kind of like absolutely just angry, bloodthirsty madman who just wants to like actually defeat the United States military, or at the same time I could be principled and think that that's the only thing that necessary to defeat US hegemony. So it's one of those things. It's up in the air, but I do want them to be socialist. I know that.
My point is, if they were to become
the next what? Sorry.
Just real quick, I was going to say, I think this question can be answered fairly simply. Historically, if you look at sort of the history of China under Mao through Deng, through, how it is today, I think it's fairly clear.
Yeah, because that's one of the things, even Mao, one of the things that he done during the revolution in China was to bring all of these smaller provinces together. China wasn't united at the time of Mao, was it? But one of his greatest achievements was uniting China, was it not?
AMT, yeah.
All right, so 2 more questions. So one question from Capra. Could you go ahead?
Hello.
Hello. Okay, so just a little question for the Marxist project. Which thinker or thinkers do you see yourself, or would you want to make more fundamentals videos about, aside from Marx and Lenin?
Yeah, I guess I think I'm coming close to the end of the Fundamentals of Marx series, because I'm finally finishing making videos on the main contents, volumes 2 and 3 of Capital. And then beyond that, I'm not entirely sure what I have mapped out. I know that I want to do a video, or possibly a few videos, on Althusser, and I want, beyond that, might want to explore some of the international politics theories in Marxism. But as far as like focusing on a single thinker, I'm not sure. I'm obviously open to suggestions, but the Fundamentals series was really designed to help people familiarize themselves with like the contents of Capital, volumes 1, 2, and 3. And I don't know of any other thinker that has that kind of like central body of texts that would be worth focusing on for a series. But if there is, I'm obviously open to it. It's just that it requires so much preparation that it'd have to be like a really concerted effort, I guess.
All right, so the last question is going to be from ACAP Cortez.
Good evening, you're live on the air.
Hey, can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Before I start, I just want to say to the Marxist project that it's really cool to be able to be on this Discord and communicate with you guys. And I've watched all of your videos, and I think they're really good. So keep up the good work. Well, I kind of changed my question. I'm not gonna lie, but I guess I first wanted to see what an external analysis towards Americans' fascist phase would look like. Because, I mean, from what I've seen and what I personally believe is just that it eventually will reach to that end. And even with leftist organizations and with leftist unity trying to fight against it, it seems that we would have to find more external support from countries that would be willing to lead that. And I guess it's just more of a concern about whether we can trust that. And I think someone already discussed towards that about fighting against U.S. imperialism and fighting against the next phase of U.S. fascism. But I don't know, for me personally, it's just like, it's hard to get to that stage in which we do fight against it. when we have liberals telling us different things in different sides to that kind of skew the whole the movement.
I mean, like
as a whole.
I had said before, I think that the next stages for the left in the United States involve cooperation with the left beyond the United States. And I really think that's just true for every country. And just from my experience here, and on my channel, there is a tendency to sort of establish those international connections. And they're all very primitive at the moment. But yeah, as we start to sort of enter the later stages of capitalism, if you want to call them that, or at least a more chaotic, degenerated form of liberal polity in the United States, we're definitely going to need to rely on support from, movements abroad, movements closer to us. I don't think that any solution, any kind of adequate response or organization can be done in an isolated manner or like highly localized. It's going to have to be very well coordinated. And I think that the positive end of that is that we have the means to make all of that happen now. Living in the 21st century, these kinds of coordinations are so easily available to us that it's just a matter of going through on them, and establishing those networks and teaching ourselves and transforming the localities that we're all in.
I also want to just take a minute to sort of understand what we mean by fascism, right? Because I think a lot of people define it differently, and this is why questions like this become kind of grey, because of, definitions, essentially. I think it was in State and Revolution, right, when Lenin talks about, an analogy for capitalism being sort of a gorgeous luxury house, right? And you walk in and you see the finery and you see the luxury and everything looks great. But ultimately in the basement, you have the true power base of capitalism, right? You have the sort of the military, the police force, the violent elements of capitalism that's required in order to keep capitalism going, right? And you can sort of tie a thinker back to your previous question, right, about who the left should really look into. And I vote Antonio Gramsci here. If the prison notebooks, you want to talk about, consent to be ruled, cultural hegemony, essentially. But I think a good way of understanding capitalism here is that capitalists want to rule ultimately through soft power, right? They want to rule through control of the media, the propaganda networks, so that their control is somewhat covert, right? Fascism, for me, is when they drop this facade and they rule not through the soft power, but through, direct, hard military power. And, the contradictions within capitalism and the imperial court, I think it's only going one way, and it's only going more towards that the more time goes on. I think even if you, look at the United States over the last 4 years, you can see that they're, actively throwing people into vans now, right? So you can see that, the tensions are heightening, and the capitalist state, the more it breaks down, the more it's going to rule by, open violence and open force.
I just want to say that support my argument earlier, which is why you're such a good co-host and why I love you, comrade, is because asking about, why Trump was more overtly fascist, Trump overtly saying, if you desecrate these statues of slave owners, then you're going to get like 20 years in jail. We're just going to throw away the key. And again, that's just another display of overt fascism.
It's strange because there are kind of ebbs and flows to it because, going back, don't forget that, the Black Panther Party were, literally assassinated by the FBI in their homes, right? And that's going back many years now. And we haven't seen, I don't think we've seen something quite like that. I might be wrong.
What was that? What was that neighborhood that got bombed?
Oh, the Move bombing, Philadelphia.
Yeah. Again, but I know the next time we do see something like that is when the SES come through my door and litter me up with loads of 9mm bullets from a flipping MP5 or like some other like YouTube or something like that. That's what it would look like. Just to put that into scale of, Fred Hampton being assassinated, that's literally like me or like Brett O'Shea like getting assassinated. And I do think about these things seriously because it's the exact same thing. It's just like the Marxist project, touch wood, ending up in jail for and by some fascist governments because he's producing left-wing content, and then suddenly he's forced to write his prison diaries. You know what I'm saying? And all of us comrades are supporting him, saying free the Marxist project, and then we're just stuck reading all of his diaries from jail. And that's what it's like, just to put these things into perspectives of history. It's not just history, it's not some story. That's what it would look like today. And I don't put it past the United States to do something like that one day. One day they might have to start throwing us into jail. We don't know, but that's why people protect themselves online. That's why they use aliasness. That's why they use VPNs, and that's because the people don't trust the government, and that's because they've historically locked us up and assassinated and murdered us. It's class war.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, no matter how bad you think the global surveillance state is, it's 10 times worse, no doubt.
Sorry to interrupt, but might I ask how we could also stop external capitalist influences? Because I mean, if you see the militias that they're creating, like the Proud Boys, you see that much of the leadership is also externally outsourced. I mean, the guy's a Cuban gusano, if we don't use that term, I'll apologize. But I mean, that's how I see it. They're not just they're not just going through these phases anymore. They're deliberately using militia to try to suppress any movements and using any form of capitalism that they can, whether it's national or international.
That's why the president in Brazil is recognized as overtly fascist, because you have police going through the streets just absolutely just having firefights with people in favelas. There's nothing more mask off than these kill squads. With that said, I think that's going to be our last question. So we really hope that people have enjoyed this tonight. We've certainly enjoyed it. We hope that they found it valuable. Again, the Marxist project, always there. We're going to probably be doing this for decades. I mean, I insist that you do Marxist project because it's only going to get better. Again, support goes a long way. It's great that you would listen and support us, but again, we'd also love to hear from you one day as well, and bring out your unique qualities. Again, special thanks to our host, the International Leftist Library. Special thanks to the Marxist Project. It was great to speak to you, comrade. Again, we will personally, continue to support your work and learn from your work as I have done in the past. It's so well said, so dense in information, but so easy to understand. And again, to all of you in the chat, I'll give you a shout out as well. We've got Craig, the recorder. He's probably a robot, so there's no point in me shouting him out. But we've also got ACAB, Cortez, Exiled Monkey, Feasting on Dubs, Visa, Got No Jams, Horatio, Capra, Malaria Trump, Rick Sanchez, of course, Chairman, myself, Shibby, the Marxist Project, the Zen Marxist, Tiddy Scooter, and Lightning Lord. Thank you. I mean, it is our pleasure doing this. Again, we'd happily do this anytime. Just give us a shout out. We've got the Marxist Project on YouTube, the Zen Marxist on YouTube, or is it lumpen.libsyn.com, patreon.com/lumpen podcast. Again, the Marxist Project has one also. Reach out to us, tell us what you think. And also we'll have the International Leftist linked in our show notes as well, so that people can go and join that community. Again, you've heard a few questions from them. Very thoughtful comrades on a server that, again, has so much informational source material to learn from Marxism, anarchism, and there's even some liberals on the server too, which is excellent. And that's what we do in late stage imperialism, is we let these libs in and discuss, as long as they behave and are asking questions sincerely. It's important that we're not being anti-sectarian, we're not being classist, and we're just generally loving our fellow human beings.
I just talk to chat a sec. So there were questions in the chat that I never got round to, and this goes for anyone. You can DM me any question, and I'll make sure to answer all of them, because there were really good questions I saw in the chat that never made it through to me. So if Vanessa especially, I don't know if you're listening or whatever, but hit me up, DM me all those questions. I'll answer any and all questions I can. Same goes for anyone. DM me about anything, and I'll answer any questions and everything.
And this is the materialism and why it's good to ask questions as well as answer them, because all the questions that we are asked and then we're forced to think about as we produce more content, we remember that we're being asked about a certain thing and we know that people want to know these answers. So again, as we've said, it all builds towards a global class consciousness. So engagement is super important. Thank you all in the chat for joining us. But with that said, we'll love yous and leave yous.
Thank you, everyone. It was a real pleasure.
Yeah, thank you all. It was great.
Oh, yeah. Thank you.
Workers and lumpen of the world, unite.